a young boy was playing an online RPG and strategy game on his computer. Even while he was hospitalized, out of nowhere, his body felt heavy and everything went black. His mind was swept away, sinking to the depths of an imaginary ocean, until suddenly, he woke up in a forest filled with cool air and overcast skies. Seated on a stone throne, to top it off, a woman stepped forward, addressing him as if she'd been waiting for him to wake up. As she emerged from the shadows, the boy immediately recognized her. It was none other than Atu, an elf who called him king. The game he'd been playing while bedridden was a dark fantasy 4X strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing before him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minagra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiled and said, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he'd beaten Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minagra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they'd played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry. She knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle. Maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here. But she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations. No doubt about it, she said, it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Atu introduced herself as the child born from the mud who would bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed with secondhand embarrassment. He realized how much harder it was to say such things in real life than it was in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Their civilization, infamous for being ruthless, but also meticulous and highly skilled in internal affairs. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minagra's first move should be, and, in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summoned a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawled out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, if they were being honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minagra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind as they acted. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First things first, the king ordered the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the insect scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. Summoning that scout had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. Setting up a settlement, a base of operations, would take another 20. Atu pointed out that emergency production was expensive, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or, at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3 less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minagra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them forest, as far as the eye could see. So far, there were no monsters in sight. Atu thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but she found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was nothing at all to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game. But Atu Lamacenta's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Era Takudo soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. Takudo explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information about the area. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of Dark Elves appeared before the stone throne where Minagra's two companions sat. Earlier that day, the same group was making its way through the forest. One elf turned to Gia, their leader, and said they should just leave the cursed lands. There was no point in leaving the woods now. But Gia reminded them that they had already been exiled from their homeland, they had nowhere else to go, and honestly, their children wouldn't survive much longer under these conditions. Considering how lush the place was, there had to be food somewhere. A female elf pointed out that at the edge of the unexplored territory of Idaragia, there stood the vast, accursed forest, the cursed lands. All the books said something evil had been sealed there. Whatever it was, it would never allow life to flourish. Gia brushed this off, telling Emily that it was just superstition. The trees were clearly growing just fine. With that, the leader insisted no one could give up now, not at such a critical moment, and reminded them that their proud spirits and the ghosts of their ancestors would surely guide them through this hardship. Still, after these motivating words, Gia couldn't deny that the forest was truly frightening. But curse or not, that wasn't an excuse to leave. His people still had hope. As long as they had the strength, finding food was the priority. And that's how the band of Dark Elves found Minagra's two founders seated on the stone throne. To them, Era Takudo was nothing more than a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made Gia break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing evil incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Gia gathered himself and stepped forward. Bowing before the figure on the throne, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazaram clan. His own name was Gia Najiv, the leader of their warriors, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the land's master. With a chilling expression, Atu Lamacenta recognized that this dark fairy truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason behind it. Gia explained that their clan once lived in Idaragia, but they'd been persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Gia more and more anxious, not wanting to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takudo commented on how thin the Dark Elves looked, and Gia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food in this place so far. Honest about his feelings, the Dark Elf wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takudo mentioned that these taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Gia had never seen fruit like this before, and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples, smiles spreading across their faces as the sweet, juicy flavor hit them. But that wasn't all. Takudo opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Gia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them who'd also escaped into these lands, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, Gia asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takudo listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread, vegetables, and greens too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Gia Najiv reflected on how the Dark Elves had always been despised as outcasts from the light, barely tolerated thanks only to the mercy of the so-called fairies of light. Marked by scorn, Gia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them in their darkest moments. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najiv of the Mazaram clan finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger that haunted the community. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news anyone could hope for. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village, and Gia watched the scene, deeply satisfied. When asked how he'd managed to find so much, he simply answered that he stumbled upon it, all while the ominous figure of Era Takudo lingered in his mind. Later that night, while the community slept, Najiv sat by a campfire, The old elder Molter came over to compliment the chief on his work. Molter said he'd lived a long life, but never, in all those years, had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeeb agreed he'd never even heard of food like this either, and that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the Mazaram clan to such unusual circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to Imlay, there was a legend about a being sealed away in the cursed lands. Molter was stunned, wondering if the expedition party had encountered the Ruin King, a figure found, at least in part, in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the Ruin King would appear, bringing devastation to all, forcing people to start over from zero. As much as no one could say for sure if this would ever come to pass, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but he had to admit that frightening appearance fit the title of Ruin King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words to some extent. Whatever the case may be, even if there's no certainty whether this entity is truly the King of Ruin, Molter senses that it's nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, the elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia might have given something to the entity in exchange for the food, but the chief insists that isn't the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return, but Jia swears there was no price at all, no strings attached. According to him, it genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy from that spirit. His Grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as His Grace and starts to suspect that the leader of Mazaram must have fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists that they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people when they were on the brink of starvation. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done in the presence of the King of Ruin. But even Molter can't come up with an answer to that, so he apologizes for his outburst to the bravest warrior of their tribe. From here on out, he declares, as the head of the Mazaram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. In the end, all these two leaders want is for their people to find peace again. Meanwhile, back with Minagra's so-called founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation, and that means conserving magic. Takudo, a little sheepish despite his charitable act, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takudo, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, the kid genuinely isn't much of a communicator. Honestly, he never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. The next day, Elder Molter asks the young leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits. Once the young elf agrees, the experienced elder grows concerned about what that entity might want in exchange for helping their people. Even though Najeeb insists she never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows all too well. Evil beings always expect some sort of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest in search of food, they might still return empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted. Maybe that's their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing: the fate of their people rests in their hands. Meanwhile, the insect serving Takudo was listening to every word of their conversation. The scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food they'd received in a single trip. Takudo, on his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and left as soon as possible. The truth is, he worries he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle negotiations on her master's behalf. which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. As night falls, Gia Najib arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazaram, leader of the Dark Elves. Before anything else, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity in providing food to his people, then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the cue, she introduces him as Era Takudo, Lord of the Apocalypse, Sovereign of Ruin, and demands he be addressed as formally as possible, leaving Najib visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Quietly observing, Takudo thinks everything is going smoothly so far, and Atu tells the elves they can take their food and leave. Molter then asks how he might repay the King of Ruin for his aid, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never possibly offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazaram clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions whether the elves are planning something behind this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takudo whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She snaps, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and so should be annihilated. Raising her voice, Atu declares their heads would look perfect mounted on pillars. Takudo, meanwhile, urges everyone to calm down, guessing the Mazaram just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to set their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazaram's faces, Takudo realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Era Takudo is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazaram clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia Najib is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takudo immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Moreover, if the Mazaram want to keep the lives that were spared, they mustn't speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takudo wonders if this is truly the right thing to do. If the Mazaram are exiled, it's likely they'll collapse somewhere along the way, and surely they won't just stand by and watch their own downfall, knowing exile might well mean death. With this on his mind, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what on earth the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takudo plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees that it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minagra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takudo admits it's risky, but asks Atu to remember what the homunculi look like, and whether she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens, admitting it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity. Atu turns to the Mazaram and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Lamisanta lays it all out. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate, but adding a personal note. Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takudo to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazaram had finally agreed to become citizens of Minagra. Even though they hesitated over the idea of becoming evil, deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takudo was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minegra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazaram clan would be protected by the great king of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him in anger toward those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Emily felt the same way. She declared that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Gia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazaram leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Era Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atulamacenta simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked over the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on, and, flailing on the floor like a child throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position. There were already 2 major nations on the continent. To the east, the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, El-Na, a kingdom of elves who worshipped nature. If either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there would be nothing left, not a single stone standing, especially since Minegra was only just beginning and still incredibly weak. To make matters worse, these cursed lands didn't even have a single natural resource they could harvest. But despite all that, it wasn't only bad news. Minegra did have the homunculi as its base population. They weren't the brightest, but they were happy. And now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back again, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribal elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elven leader. This time, Gia brought along his assistant, Emily, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazaram would be assigned to key positions in Minegra's administration. Molter would oversee the state's affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Gia Najiv would lead Minegra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Gia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that, if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing that, Takuto nearly soiled himself, leaving Gia genuinely puzzled. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace. With everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Najiv had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Gia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Gia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emily just mentioned that she'd work hard, prompting Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Gia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Era Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emily added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic, so Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet, and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested, in order to maintain the environment. Emily admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it took centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements, and that this knowledge actually comes from their mighty king era Takuto. In fact, she makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields, and that the people of Minagra are blessed to receive his favor. Emily asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emily says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. As soon as the king notices this, the nation of Minagra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana costs varying based on how complex the item is. In the very next moment, a group of soldiers stood guard over religious figures in a region blanketed by snow. One of them remarked that, from what he'd heard, the saint was said to possess a special power, though he didn't really believe it. The other soldier just told him to wait and see. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a horde of goblins attacked the group. The saint stepped forward, preparing to punish the invaders for disturbing the peace of the holy kingdom of Qualia and for the sin of abandoning the holy god Arlos. With a single sweep of her staff, she conjured an extraordinary blaze that wiped out the monsters, causing the sky to magically open and fill the field with beautiful flowers. According to an expedition officer, this power is part of the reason the nation of Qualia is able to keep evil at bay and maintain good relations with the elven nation. The saint buries her enemies in flames and sends them off with flowers. She is one of the 7 great saviors of the Idaragia continent, Saint Selena of the Flowered Burials. Beside her, the cardinal announced that he'd already dispatched the paladins to the nearby villages. The saint, however, brought up the ominous prophecy of apocalypse in the Cursed Lands, insisting that paladins should be sent there to investigate as well. But the cardinal flatly refused, showing any interest in the Cursed Lands, south of the Black Continent, was out of the question, and Central would never authorize the use of paladins for such a mission. Even so, the saint resolved to look into it herself, prompting the man to remind her she was no longer just a simple village girl. Seeing she wouldn't be swayed, he ultimately agreed to send the paladins under his personal command. With that settled, the cardinal walked away, muttering insults about the country bumpkin saint, while she remained focused only on saving the people of that region. Meanwhile, over in the Cursed Lands, Adu the Meyer roused the people to get to work and start building the nation. Part of this was constructing the throne where King Takuto would sit, and soon they revealed the council chamber that would house the sovereign's most suitable seat. The elf was so excited she believed Minagra would soon become powerful enough to rule the land and pierce the very skies. In the midst of this, the elven administrators presented themselves to the king, as planned, to kick off the council meeting. Emily handed the nation's leader a set of garments, so he could finally say he was dressed as a true king. With that done, Atu announced it was time to discuss domestic policies, though Takuto seemed far more interested in admiring his new outfit than deciding the nation's future. Embarrassed, his assistant decided to first discuss things among themselves and only consult the king on certain key points. As the meeting got underway, Molter asked which buildings should be erected first. Gia explained they'd already started preparing the land, leveling the ground and trimming branches. Atu responded that their first project would be a food production facility. After all, no one can wage war on an empty stomach. Molter wondered if the king couldn't just use his powers to create an endless supply of food. Lamacenta took offense at the mere suggestion that their nation's leader should be stuck doing that all the time. Plus, she pointed out, they'd still have to figure out how to distribute the food as the nation grew. After Molter apologized, the king's assistant put a strange plant on the table that made the other elves recoil. She explained it was a meat tree, one of their civilization's food production facilities. It produces mysterious meat that tastes just like human flesh. Molter admitted that not everyone could handle eating human meat every day, but Atu said they'd only plant those trees to start with, and Takuto recognized that everyone has different tastes. Atu added that they'd need a hut to manage the meat tree and a storage facility for the food. Emily took charge of that. Then the tree itself spoke, in a creepy voice, "Be nice to me," sending Emily into a panic. The next topic on the council's agenda was research. In Lamacenta's view, as a small nation, they urgently needed to acquire advanced magical technologies, a sentiment the king shared with excitement. Molter confessed he was also happy to study magic, since it was already a passion of his. He asked what kind of magic they'd be researching, and Atu didn't hesitate: military magic. She explained that normal magic could only strike dozens at once, while military magic could decimate armies of thousands, reshape the land, and offer all sorts of strategic advantages. Molter and Gia were amazed that such spells even existed, and Atu confirmed they'd need to select some talented mages to lead the research. Takudo assured them it wasn't a particularly difficult technology, so it should be developed quickly. With that, Elder Molter enthusiastically took charge of researching military magic. Last on the agenda was military planning. Gia pointed out that they first needed to organize an army. Takudo replied that they wouldn't focus on that just yet, and Lamacenta explained that armies don't produce anything, they only consume resources. Gia understood, but reminded everyone that their current group of warriors wasn't enough to protect the king, making matters worse. Molter revealed that both he and Gia had bounties on their heads as leaders of the Dark Elves. Faced with this situation, King Era Takudo declared that they would create a hero. Atu loved the idea the hero might be expensive to produce, but had virtually no upkeep costs. Gia asked what exactly this hero would be, and the elf explained that in Minegra, there are several heroes who serve the king. All of them are powerful and possess unique abilities. Though they're all monsters in their own right, there are various conditions that must be met to summon them. But soon they should be able to call at least one. What's more, as the king reminded everyone, armies are expensive and draw too much attention. That's why creating a hero could be a smart move. Minegra needed to stay as under the radar as possible while it was still small. And so, they set out to create a hero and give Gia Najeev some much-needed peace of mind. After making that decision, Takudo remarks that, honestly, discussing internal policies is actually kind of fun. Putting that aside, he reflects that they're also collecting mana from their citizens, which means the nation's mana reserves are in good shape. The amount they collect is directly tied to the happiness of the people, so the happier the citizens, the more the nation thrives. Ultimately, it's the ruler's duty to lead their people to the peak of happiness. Meanwhile, over in the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a warrior named Lonius has his prayer interrupted by what's apparently an emergency, and he's not happy about Vertil's lack of respect for this sacred place. As Lonius tucks his pendant ring into his robe, Vertil jokes that the man's wedding band must have turned into a lucky charm. He asks the names of Lonius's wife and daughter, but Lonius shrugs him off, saying that's got nothing to do with their mission. Vertil insists, explaining that a high-ranking paladin is demanding an answer. Reluctantly, Lonius replies that his wife is named Marcia, and his daughter is Mina. Satisfied, the superior notes that they'll be traveling for a few days, and jokes that he was planning to tease Lonius if he started calling out his wife's or daughter's name in his sleep. Unbothered by the mockery, Lonius points out that, according to rumor, the person involved in their mission is pretty rude, but undeniably skilled and accomplished. Either way, Vertil is annoyed to be sent to the Dark Continent, but Lonius explains it's because they need to investigate a revelation Saint Selena received. If they succeed, they'll earn some favor with the Southern Province's Congress, even if, as a lower-ranked paladin, Lonius will be the first blamed if things go wrong. About the mission itself, Vertil laments that their unit is far too small to handle something as delicate as a revelation since it's just the two of them, and they've been told to fill out the rest of the party with mercenaries. Lonius agrees it's rare for them to investigate outside their borders, and there aren't even guidelines on the size of the forces they send. Vertil can't help but wonder what the bigwigs are thinking, while Lonius reflects that, even among the priesthood and the paladins, it's impossible to know what's happening behind the scenes. Clearly, there must be a reason they forced Vertil to join him just before departure. As they leave the building, the pair runs into a group of soldiers who salute Chief Lonius. Vertil assumes his partner must have hired these mercenaries, and suddenly he's much more motivated to get this job over with. Lonius considers that, despite Vertil's attitude, he's still a high-ranking paladin, which will definitely boost their team's chances of survival. Back in Minegra, things seem to be running smoothly. Takudo watches the whole process unfold, his eyes filled with joy and hope for the future. He's seen visions of his civilization getting started and hitting its stride in the game countless times before, but now he gets to witness it firsthand, as if it were real life. And that's just incredible. Soon after, he and Atu are taken by Emla to visit the nation's residential area. According to their guide, the Dark Elves are experts at building homes up in the treetops. But since they've been prioritizing the meat trees, not many houses have gone up yet. At least the food trees are growing well, and the food storehouse should be finished soon. Emily also mentions that, over at the Institute of Magical Research, Elder Molter is gathering those with magical talent to kick off some new research. Plus, they've discovered a water source nearby and are looking into building an aqueduct. Right now, the building where the king stays also doubles as the public office for paperwork, but in time, they'll put together a proper administrative staff. For now, though, this is the best they can do with what they've got. Takuto is pleased with his subordinate's initiative and resourcefulness. She's even handled things he never asked for. And most importantly, the Dark Elves, who were once so thin and exhausted, are now bursting with life. Emily, a little anxious, asks what the king thinks of everything, since they've all been working so hard to repay the mercy he's shown them. Takuto assures her he thinks it's all amazing and says he's happy to welcome the Dark Elves as citizens. Overwhelmed by being recognized for her hard work, Emily bursts into tears. After regaining her composure, she points out that the meat trees are nearly ready for harvest, all thanks to the agricultural tools the king provided. With a haunting voice, one of the trees claims its fruit is almost ripe enough to eat, sending chills down Emily's spine, while Atu, thrilled, celebrates that they've finally secured enough food to sustain Minagra's residence. Emily then wants to show her superiors the water source she'd mentioned earlier. On the way, as they make their way through the forest, she senses something odd in the woods, and her suspicions are confirmed when they reach the water. Gia and Molter arrive soon after to assess the feasibility of building an aqueduct. But Emily reveals, unfortunately, that the water is no longer good. Molter examines the color and agrees, but Atu takes a sip and declares it's perfectly fine. The Dark Elves are taken aback, but Atu reminds them, this place is known as the Cursed Lands, and this is proof that the area has truly become part of Minagra's domain. Takuto asks the elves to take a deep breath, and as they do, they feel their minds become sharper and their bodies noticeably stronger. Atu explains that the Cursed Lands benefit evil beings while harming those who are neutral or good. Hearing this, Gia Najiv drinks the water and finds nothing wrong with it. Takuto points out that this conquered territory is perfect for defense, and soon, every bit of land belonging to Minagra will be the same. Grateful for the king's immense power, Elder Molter notes that the only downside is that this transformation makes it easier for enemies to spot Minagra's territory, a problem that will only grow as they expand. Once again, Gia urges that they need to form an army. Unfazed, Atu reminds everyone that they'll be creating a hero, to which Molter admits, with some confusion, that he has no idea what that even means. When the moment was right, Atu Lamacinta found it easier to show what she meant rather than keep explaining. Without warning, dark, magical tendrils shot out from her back, slicing through the trees behind her like razors. After that display, the elf revealed that she herself was a hero, and that what they'd just seen was nothing compared to what she could do at her peak. In other words, heroes have the power to wipe out entire armies on their own. Takuto explained that heroes only grow stronger as time goes on, even if they barely lift a finger. So, as long as they manage to keep themselves isolated, Atu alone would be enough to defend the nation for now, and with every passing day, she'd become even more formidable. Still, after his subordinate's little demonstration, the king couldn't help but complain that she didn't have to level half the forest just to prove a point. Once again, the sheer might of King Ira Takuto and Atu Lamacinta left the Dark Elves awestruck, completely won over. They vowed to build a palace worthy of their king as soon as possible. Truthfully, Takuto didn't care much for the idea of living in a palace. He figured he could just live in a regular house like everyone else. The Dark Elves, however, were scandalized by the thought. The idea that the supreme ruler would settle for the same standard as his people filled them with guilt. As Takuto scratched his head, Atu pointed out that, sure, building a palace would be costly, but it could also generate resources, and from what she could tell, it would boost the citizens' happiness as well. With that, Takuto admitted that, once upon a time, he'd actually wanted a floating castle, so maybe having a palace wouldn't be so bad after all. The Dark Elves were fascinated by the idea of a palace soaring through the sky, something that not long ago would have sounded completely impossible. But after everything they'd witnessed, they were starting to believe that with their king, even a flying city might one day exist. Once more, the elves dropped to their knees and swore to serve their lord with all they had. Praying for Minagra's eternal prosperity, Takuto, for his part, was visibly embarrassed by all the attention. But since everyone seemed motivated, he encouraged them to keep up the momentum and continue building up the nation, little by little. Check out these videos appearing on your screen and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.